The desert wind cut across Fort Harrison like a blade, carrying with it the scent of sage and gun oil. September in Arizona meant heat that lingered long past sunset, the kind that made men grateful for the shade of a mess hall and the cold beer that waited in their quarters. For most soldiers on the base, tonight would be just another evening meal, another day closer to rotation, another story to tell about the new recruits who thought they were tougher than they actually were. For Sergeant Evelyn Thorne, it would be the night her cover began to unravel. She had been on the base for 3 days. 3 days of playing the role of Elizabeth Crawford, a mild-mannered supply clerk transferred from Fort Bragg to handle administrative overflow. 3 days of keeping her head down, her voice soft, her movements deliberately clumsy enough to blend into the background noise of military bureaucracy. 3 days of being invisible. That was about to end. The sand was different in Kuwait, coarser. It got into everything during those final days of February 1991, when the ground war of Desert Storm turned the Iraqi positions into killing fields, and the world watched America's military machine roll across the desert like an unstoppable tide. Staff Sergeant Garrett Calloway was 25 years old and already a veteran of Delta Force operations that would remain classified for decades. He crouched in the darkness outside a concrete bunker 30 miles north of the Saudi border, his M4 carbine pressed against his shoulder, his breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The night vision goggles turned the world into shades of green and black, but he could see clearly enough. 4 tangos on the rooftop, 2 more at the entrance. Intel suggested at least a dozen inside. The woman beside him moved like smoke. Captain Elizabeth Thorne had been with Delta for 18 months, one of the first female operators to make it through selection, and she had proven herself in firefights from Panama to the Philippines. She was 30 years old, brilliant, fearless, and according to the mission brief, the only person who could identify the Iraqi colonel they were hunting tonight. 2 minutes, Garrett whispered into his throat mic. Elizabeth nodded. Her rifle came up smooth as silk, the suppressor already attached. The plan was simple. She would take the rooftop guards. Garrett and the rest of the team would breach from the west entrance. They would extract the colonel and be back at the rally point before the Iraqi army even knew they were there. It should have worked. The first 2 shots were perfect. The rooftop guards dropped without a sound. Elizabeth moved forward, Garrett covering her 6. They reached the entrance. The breaching charge was in place. 3 seconds to detonation. That was when Lieutenant Nathaniel Westbrook's voice crackled over the radio. Abort! Abort! Enemy reinforcements inbound. Fall back to extraction. Garrett froze. Something in Westbrook's tone was wrong. Too calm. Too rehearsed. He looked at Elizabeth and saw the same doubt in her eyes. Negative, Elizabeth said into her mic. We're 30 seconds from target. We can complete. The explosion came from inside the bunker, not from their breaching charge. Someone had triggered it remotely, early, and the blast door was still sealed. The entrance became an inferno. Garrett felt the heat singe his eyebrows even from 10 feet back. Elizabeth stumbled, and he caught her arm, pulling her away from the flames. But the fire was the distraction. The real attack came from behind. 3 shots, silenced, professional. Elizabeth jerked once, twice, 3 times as the rounds punched through her back. She collapsed into Garrett's arms, blood spreading across her desert camouflage like spilled ink on parchment. Contact rear, Garrett screamed, spinning, returning fire. But the shooter was gone, vanished into the darkness like he had never existed. Elizabeth's eyes found his. She tried to speak, blood bubbling at her lips. Her hand gripped his vest with fading strength. Find him, she managed. Westbrook sold us. Then the light went out of her eyes, and Garrett was holding a corpse. The official report said Captain Elizabeth Thorne died during a firefight with Iraqi Republican Guard forces. Heroic, tragic, classified. Lieutenant Nathaniel Westbrook received a commendation for calling the abort that saved the rest of the team. No investigation was launched. The Iraqi colonel escaped. The war ended 2 days later, and everyone moved on. Everyone except Garrett Calloway. He spent the next 2 years trying to prove Westbrook had betrayed them. He found nothing. No evidence, no witnesses. Westbrook's file was spotless, his career trajectory perfect. By 1995, Westbrook was a captain. By 2000, a major. By 2010, a colonel. Garrett stayed enlisted, transferred to logistics, stopped looking for revenge, and started looking for peace. He thought he had found it, until 3 days ago, when the base directory listed their new commanding officer, Colonel Nathaniel Westbrook. Present day. Eve Thorne walked across the sun-bleached concrete of Fort Harrison with her shoulders slightly hunched, her gait just irregular enough to suggest someone who spent more time behind a desk than on a training field. She had perfected this walk over the course of 8 years as a Navy SEAL. The way you moved told people everything about what you were, and right now she needed to be nothing. Just another clerk. Just another warm body shuffling papers and processing requisitions. Nothing to notice, nothing to remember. The mess hall loomed ahead, a squat concrete building that could have been transplanted from any military installation in the world. It was 1800 hours, dinner time, the perfect opportunity to observe without being observed, to catalog faces and voices and the invisible hierarchies that governed every military unit. She had studied the personnel files before arriving. 473 soldiers currently stationed at Fort Harrison, support staff, training cadre, a handful of special operations personnel rotating through for desert warfare exercises. All of them under the command of a man who, according to her classified briefing, might be selling military intelligence to foreign actors. Colonel Nathaniel Westbrook, decorated veteran, war hero, possible traitor. Eve's mission was simple: gather evidence, maintain cover, do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Her handlers at SEAL Team 3 had been very clear on that last point. This was an intelligence operation, not a direct action mission. She was a scalpel, not a hammer. She pushed open the mess hall doors and was immediately hit by the familiar assault of institutional food smells, fluorescent lighting, and the low rumble of 300 conversations happening at once. Long metal tables stretched in neat rows, soldiers clustered by rank and unit, the unwritten rules of military social structure as rigid here as anywhere else. Eve grabbed a tray and moved through the serving line, accepting portions of something that might have been chicken, might have been turkey, definitely was not worth thinking about too hard. She kept her eyes down, her expression neutral, every movement deliberately unremarkable. That was when she noticed them. 4 young soldiers sat near the back of the mess hall, their voices louder than necessary, their body language radiating the particular brand of arrogance that came from being just dangerous enough to be cocky, just inexperienced enough to be stupid. The leader was obvious, 6'2", muscular, with the kind of square jaw that suggested Irish ancestry and the kind of swagger that suggested someone who had never actually been tested. His name tape read, O'Malley. Eve cataloged him automatically. Corporal rank insignia, infantry unit patch. Probably 22, maybe 23. 8 months in service, if the brevity of his ribbon rack was any indication. The kind of soldier who thought basic training made him a warrior, who confused fitness with competence, who had never seen actual combat, but was absolutely certain he would dominate when the time came. The 3 soldiers with him fit predictable patterns. One smaller, aggressive, compensating for his size with attitude. One loud, joking, playing class clown to stay relevant in the group. One younger, quieter, following because he did not yet know better. Eve marked them as potential complications and looked for an empty table away from their section. She almost made it. Garrett Calloway sat in the far corner of the mess hall with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He had not touched his food. He was not here to eat. He was here because this was where soldiers gathered, where information flowed, where the invisible currents of base politics played out in real time. And he was here because 3 days ago, he had seen a ghost. The new supply clerk. Elizabeth Crawford, according to her file, 27 years old, transfer from Fort Bragg, administrative specialist with an unremarkable service record and a face that made Garrett's heart stop every time he saw it. She looked exactly like Elizabeth Thorne, not identical. The hair was different, the eyes were a shade lighter. The bone structure was similar, but not quite the same. But the way she moved, the way she held herself, the particular tilt of her head when she was listening to someone talk, those were Elizabeth's gestures, Elizabeth's mannerisms. Garrett had spent 33 years trying to forget Elizabeth Thorne's face. Seeing it walking around his base, wearing a supply clerk's uniform, was like having a wound he thought had scarred over, suddenly ripped open again. He had pulled her personnel file. Nothing suspicious, nothing remarkable, just another soldier doing an unremarkable job. Except soldiers with unremarkable jobs did not move the way Elizabeth Crawford moved. Garrett had spent 2 decades in special operations before his knees and his patience gave out, and he transferred to logistics. He knew what trained operators looked like. The way they scanned rooms, the way they positioned themselves with clear lines of sight to exits, the way they maintained situational awareness, even when they appeared relaxed. Elizabeth Crawford did all of those things, which meant Elizabeth Crawford was not a supply clerk, which meant someone had sent an operator to Fort Harrison under deep cover, which meant something very bad was about to happen. Eve saw the foot extend into her path a split second too late to avoid it naturally. If she had been playing her real role, she would have stepped over it without breaking stride, would have processed the threat and formulated 3 responses before her brain consciously registered the danger. But she was playing Elizabeth Crawford, slightly clumsy supply clerk, so she stumbled. Her training kicked in anyway. Her center of gravity shifted automatically. Her arms came up in a textbook balance recovery. She caught herself with a kind of fluid grace that was absolutely wrong for the character she was supposed to be playing. The mess hall did not go silent. That would have been too dramatic. But conversations nearby faltered. Heads turned. Soldiers at adjacent tables paused with forks halfway to their mouths. Corporal Brennan O'Malley's voice cut through the moment like a blade through silk. "Whoa there, little lady. You need to watch where you're going. This ain't no place for clumsy girls." The comment drew chuckles from his companions. Wyatt Donovan, the aggressive one, grinned. Dustin Kowalski, the joker, added some comment Eve did not quite catch. Colton Wheeler, the youngest, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Eve felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that every SEAL learned to control. The combat calculations ran automatically. 4 targets. O'Malley was the primary threat, standing now, 6'2" and probably 190, weight distributed poorly, stance aggressive but sloppy. Donovan was secondary, 5'9" but compact, muscle-bound, trying to look tough. Kowalski was circling to the right, hands in pockets, not an immediate danger. Wheeler hung back, clearly uncomfortable, not a threat unless the others engaged first. Eve could neutralize all 4 in under 20 seconds. Probably 15 if she was aggressive about it, but that would destroy her cover completely. "Sorry about that," she said quietly, keeping her voice level, her posture submissive. "My mistake." She tried to move past them, tried to de-escalate, tried to be Elizabeth Crawford, who would have been intimidated by 4 aggressive young men, who would have apologized and scurried away to eat her dinner in peace. But O'Malley was not finished. Garrett watched the situation develop with a growing sense of dread. He recognized the dynamic immediately. 4 young soldiers, full of testosterone and stupidity, deciding to test themselves against someone they perceived as weak. It happened on every base, in every unit. Usually it was harmless. Occasionally it was not. He saw Crawford try to walk away, saw O'Malley step in front of her, blocking her path, saw the other three spreading out slightly, creating a loose circle. This was about to get ugly. Garrett stood up. He was 58 years old. His knees ached in the morning. His back had not been quite right since that helicopter insertion went wrong in 2007, but he was still 210 pounds of scar tissue and bad memories, and his voice still carried the kind of authority that made young soldiers think twice. But before he could move, before he could cross the mess hall and defuse the situation, O'Malley made his mistake. He reached out and grabbed Crawford's shoulder. Eve's body responded before her brain could override it. 8 years of training, thousands of repetitions, muscle memory drilled so deep that conscious thought was irrelevant. She pivoted on her left foot, rotating her shoulder away from O'Malley's reaching hand. Her left hand came up and caught his wrist. Her right hand moved to his elbow. The leverage was textbook, simple physics. Control the joints, control the body. For just a moment, O'Malley found his arm twisted at an angle that sent pain shooting up to his shoulder. His confident expression shifted to surprise, then confusion. He had expected compliance or clumsy resistance. He had not expected professional-grade joint manipulation. Eve realized her mistake immediately. The technique had been too smooth, too practiced, too confident. A real supply clerk would not have moved like that. She released his arm and stepped back, trying to make it look like an instinctive reaction rather than a trained response. "Don't touch me," she said firmly. The mess hall had gone quieter now. Not silent, never silent, but the conversations nearby had definitely stopped. Soldiers were watching. O'Malley's face flushed red. Embarrassment warred with anger, and anger won. Being neutralized so easily in front of his friends, in front of the watching crowd, was exactly the kind of humiliation his personality could not tolerate. "Oh, you want to play rough?" he snarled, flexing his fingers. "Let's see how tough you really are." Donovan and Kowalski moved closer. Wheeler looked increasingly uncomfortable, but remained trapped by loyalty and peer pressure. Eve's mind raced through her options. She could continue trying to de-escalate. She could allow herself to be roughed up to maintain cover. She could end this decisively. All three options were bad. O'Malley lunged. The fight lasted 30 seconds. O'Malley came in hard, right hand extended, aiming to grab the front of Eve's uniform. It was a sloppy attack, telegraphed by his shoulder rotation, executed with more aggression than technique. Eve sidestepped, caught his extended arm, and used his own momentum against him. The judo throw was textbook. O'Malley hit the floor hard enough that soldiers 3 tables away felt the impact through the concrete. Donovan reacted immediately, rushing from her left with wild haymaker punches. Eve ducked under the first swing, stepped inside his guard, and delivered a precise strike to a pressure point on his neck. Not hard enough to cause permanent damage, just enough to send his nervous system into temporary confusion. He stumbled backward, disoriented. Kowalski tried to be clever, circling around to attack from behind. But Eve's peripheral vision and situational awareness, honed through countless combat situations, tracked his movement without her needing to turn her head. When he committed to his grab, she dropped low and swept his legs. He crashed into a nearby table with a clatter of metal trays and plastic dishes that echoed through the now silent mess hall. Wheeler stood frozen, his eyes wide. This was not how it was supposed to go. This was not how any of this was supposed to go. Eve stood in the center of the small space, barely breathing hard. Her uniform was still neat. Her expression was calm. She looked like she had just completed a routine training exercise, not defended herself against 4 attackers. O'Malley climbed slowly to his feet. His face was beyond red now, approaching purple with rage and humiliation. But as he looked at Eve standing there, something in her posture finally penetrated his anger-clouded thinking. The submissive, apologetic demeanor was gone. replaced by a quiet confidence that seemed almost dangerous. Her stance was balanced. Her hands were relaxed but positioned perfectly for whatever came next. Most importantly, there was something in her eyes that O'Malley had never seen before. The look of someone who had faced real danger and won. Garrett was already moving before the first punch was thrown. He had seen enough to know how this would end, and he had seen too much to let it play out any further. He reached the edge of the small crowd just as Eve dropped Kowalski. His voice cut through the tension like a rifle shot. What exactly is going on here? 20 years of military service gave him the kind of authority that made even angry corporals pay attention. The watching soldiers automatically stepped aside. O'Malley and his companions jerked to attention, their faces showing various combinations of embarrassment, anger, and dawning realization that this situation had just escalated beyond their control. Garrett's eyes swept over the four young men, taking in their disheveled appearances and the scattered mess on the floor, before settling on Eve with an intensity that made her deeply uncomfortable. This was the moment, the point where her cover would either hold or shatter completely. "Master Sergeant," O'Malley started, struggling to find words that would not make him sound like a complete fool. There was a misunderstanding with the new soldier here, and things got a little out of hand." "A misunderstanding," Garrett repeated slowly, his tone suggesting he found the explanation less than satisfactory. Eve remained silent. Anything she said now could potentially make things worse. She could feel Garrett studying her with professional assessment that went far beyond what a logistics sergeant should possess. "Crawford," Garrett said, reading her name tape, "you're the new transfer from Fort Bragg. Supply Administration Specialist, correct?" "Yes, Master Sergeant," Eve replied, maintaining proper military bearing. Garrett nodded slowly. "And you four decided it was appropriate to corner a fellow soldier in the mess hall?" Donovan attempted his own explanation. "Master Sergeant, it wasn't like that. She was being disrespectful, and we were just trying to teach her some military courtesy." "Military courtesy," Garrett repeated, his voice flat. "And how exactly did that work out for you?" The question hung in the air as Donovan glanced at his friends, all of whom still looked dazed. "Master Sergeant," Kowalski finally spoke up, his earlier bravado completely gone. "I think maybe we made a mistake. Things happened pretty fast, and maybe we misunderstood the situation." Garrett walked over to examine the overturned table and scattered dishes, then looked back at Eve with renewed interest. "Crawford, would you care to explain how four soldiers ended up on the ground while you remained completely unharmed?" This was the question Eve had been dreading. Any honest answer would reveal capabilities far beyond what her cover identity should possess. "I defended myself, Master Sergeant," she replied carefully. "They came at me aggressively, and I responded appropriately to protect myself." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "Defended yourself with what kind of training, soldier?" The mess hall had grown completely quiet. Eve could feel dozens of eyes focused on her. "Basic self-defense training, Master Sergeant," she said, sticking as close to the truth as possible while avoiding specifics. "Basic self-defense," Garrett mused. "In my experience, Crawford, basic self-defense training doesn't usually result in four soldiers being neutralized quite so efficiently." O'Malley was beginning to realize that his attempt to intimidate what he thought was a helpless supply clerk had turned into something that could have serious consequences for his military career. "Master Sergeant, maybe we should just forget about the whole thing. Nobody got seriously hurt, and we've all learned our lesson." But Garrett was not finished. Something about the situation did not add up. "Crawford," he said, turning his full attention back to Eve, "what exactly did you do before you enlisted?" The question was dangerous. According to her paperwork, she had worked as a civilian administrative assistant before enlisting. "I worked in office administration, Master Sergeant," Eve replied, maintaining eye contact. "Office administration," Garrett repeated slowly. "And where exactly did you pick up the kind of hand-to-hand combat skills that allowed you to handle four larger opponents with such ease?" Eve could see in his eyes that he had already reached conclusions about her training that were dangerously close to the truth. "I took some martial arts classes in high school and college, Master Sergeant," she said. Garrett stared at her for a long moment. "High school martial arts," he finally said, his tone suggesting he found her explanation less than convincing. "That must have been quite a comprehensive program." The sarcasm was barely concealed. He turned back to O'Malley and his companions. "You four are going to clean up this mess. Then you're going to report to my office at 0600 tomorrow morning for some additional training on military courtesy and proper behavior toward fellow soldiers." O'Malley started to protest, but Garrett cut him off with a look. "Did I stutter, Corporal?" "No, Master Sergeant," O'Malley replied quickly. "Good. Get this area cleaned up and get out of my sight. And if I hear about any of you bothering Crawford or any other soldier again, you'll find yourselves doing extra duty until you're old enough to retire." The four young soldiers began gathering scattered dishes, grateful to have something to do that kept them from drawing more attention. Garrett waited until most of the watching crowd had begun to disperse before speaking again. "Crawford, follow me. We're going to my office where we can have this conversation without an audience." They walked across the base in silence. The evening air had cooled slightly, though Arizona in September still meant temperatures in the 90s, even after sunset. Eve's mind raced through possible responses to the questions she knew were coming. The administrative building was a standard military structure. Gray concrete, minimal decoration, designed for function rather than aesthetics. Garrett's office was on the second floor, a small but efficiently organized space that reflected 20 years of military service. Awards and commendations covered one wall. A map marked with various deployment locations occupied another. His desk was neat and orderly, everything in its proper place. "Sit down," Garrett said, gesturing to a chair facing his desk. He closed the door behind them and took his own seat, leaning back and studying Eve with the same intensity he had shown in the mess hall. Eve sat down and waited. The first person to speak in this kind of confrontation usually found themselves at a disadvantage. 20 years, Garrett said finally. 20 years I've been in this army. I've seen a lot of soldiers with a lot of different backgrounds and skill sets. I've served with Rangers, Special Forces, Marines, even some Navy personnel on joint operations. He paused, letting his words sink in. In all that time, I've learned to recognize certain things about how people move, how they respond under pressure, how they handle themselves in confrontational situations. Eve remained silent, maintaining eye contact. "What I saw in that mess hall tonight," Garrett continued, "was not the work of someone whose combat training consisted of high school martial arts classes. What I saw was the kind of precision and efficiency that comes from professional military training, advanced professional military training." The accusation was subtle but clear. "Master Sergeant, I understand your concerns," Eve replied carefully, "but I can only tell you what's in my service record. I've been assigned to this base as a supply administration specialist, and that's the capacity in which I'm serving." Garrett leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Crawford, let me be very clear about something. I don't care what your paperwork says. I don't care what your official assignment might be. What I care about is the safety and security of the soldiers under my command." He stood up and walked to the window. "When I see someone with your obvious capabilities operating under a cover that doesn't match their skill set, it makes me wonder what else might be going on that I should know about." The word cover hit Eve like a physical blow. Garrett had essentially accused her of operating under false pretenses, which was dangerously close to the truth. "Master Sergeant," she said slowly, "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I can assure you that I'm exactly who my service record says I am." Garrett turned back to face her, and Eve could see in his eyes that he was not buying her continued denials. "Crawford, I've been doing this long enough to know when someone is hiding something important. The question is whether what you're hiding represents a threat to my soldiers or to this base." The conversation had reached a critical point. Eve knew Garrett was not going to be satisfied with continued evasions. She found herself trapped between maintaining operational security and convincing a suspicious NCO that she was not a threat to base security. Eve sat in the uncomfortable silence of Garrett's office, weighing her options while the experienced sergeant waited for her response. Through the window, she could see the base continuing its normal evening routine. "Master Sergeant Calloway," Eve said finally, her voice taking on a tone of quiet authority that had not been there before. "I think we need to have a different kind of conversation." Garrett raised an eyebrow at the change in her demeanor. The submissive, apologetic posture she had maintained earlier was gone, replaced by the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. "I'm listening." Eve took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to do could end her career or compromise critical national security operations. But Garrett's suspicions were too well-founded to be deflected with continued lies. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels," she began, looking directly into his eyes. "And I need your word that this conversation will remain between us, regardless of what you think about the information I'm going to share." Garrett leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. "You have my word, soldier, but understand that if what you're about to tell me represents a threat to this base or my personnel, my obligations to them come first." "I understand completely, Master Sergeant," Eve replied. "My name is Sergeant Evelyn Thorne, and I am assigned to this base as a supply administration specialist. That part of my cover story is accurate. What's not accurate is my background and training." The admission hung in the air between them as Garrett processed what she had just said. "Go on," he said simply. "I'm a Navy SEAL," Eve said quietly. "I've been operating under deep cover for the past 6 months as part of a classified operation that I cannot discuss in detail. My assignment to this base is legitimate, but my real purpose here goes beyond supply administration." Garrett sat in stunned silence for several moments. "A Navy SEAL," he repeated slowly. "That would certainly explain the combat capabilities I witnessed tonight." "The situation in the mess hall was exactly what I was trying to avoid," Eve continued. "Maintaining my cover requires that I avoid drawing attention to myself or demonstrating skills that would raise questions about my background." Garrett stood and pulled a bottle of water from a small refrigerator, offering one to Eve before sitting back down. "How long have you been a SEAL?" 8 years, Master Sergeant. Multiple deployments. I specialize in deep cover operations and intelligence gathering." "And your current mission on this base?" Eve hesitated, knowing she was already revealing more than operational security protocols typically allowed. "I can't discuss the specific details, but I can tell you that it involves gathering intelligence related to potential security threats. My presence here is part of a larger operation designed to protect American military assets and personnel." Garrett nodded slowly, beginning to understand the complexity of the situation he had stumbled into. "Those 4 soldiers in the mess hall have no idea how lucky they are that you showed restraint. My training includes extensive instruction in force escalation and threat assessment," Eve explained. "O'Malley and his friends were never in any real danger because they didn't represent a genuine threat. If they had, the situation would have ended very differently." "I imagine it would have," Garrett said with genuine respect in his voice. Then, after a pause, "What do you need from me?" The question surprised Eve. She had expected continued interrogation or demands for more information, not an offer of cooperation. "I need you to treat me exactly as you would any other supply administration specialist on this base. No special attention, no different treatment, and no indication to anyone else that this conversation ever took place." "That's it? That's it. My mission here is time-sensitive, and I can't afford to have my cover compromised. Tonight's incident was already more attention than I can safely handle." Garrett considered her request carefully. "What about O'Malley and his friends? They're going to have questions about what happened tonight. I'm hoping the embarrassment of being handled so easily by someone they thought was just a supply clerk will be enough to keep them quiet." Eve replied. Young soldiers don't usually like to advertise when they've been humiliated. Garrett studied her for another long moment, then nodded. You have my cooperation, Thorne. Your secret is safe with me. But I have one condition. What's that? If your mission here puts any of my soldiers at risk, or if you need backup for any reason, you come to me immediately. I don't care what your operational protocols say about maintaining cover. The safety of the personnel on this base is my responsibility. Eve felt a wave of relief wash over her. Agreed, Master Sergeant. Thank you for your understanding. Don't thank me yet, Garrett replied with a slight smile. You still have to complete whatever it is you're really here to do. As Eve prepared to leave his office, Garrett had one final question. Thorne, you said your name is Evelyn Thorne? Yes, Master Sergeant. Something flickered across Garrett's face, an old pain, briefly visible before being locked away again. You remind me of someone I used to know, someone who served with distinction, someone who died too young. Eve paused at the door, sensing there was more to that statement than simple nostalgia. Master Sergeant? But Garrett shook his head. It's nothing. Ancient history. Get some rest, Sergeant. Something tells me after tonight, staying invisible might be more challenging than you anticipated. Eve left his office with more questions than answers, unaware that the man she had just trusted with her deepest secret was carrying secrets of his own. The desert wind continued to blow across Fort Harrison, carrying with it the promise of storms on the horizon. The morning after the mess hall incident arrived with the kind of merciless Arizona sun that turned concrete into griddles. Eve Thorne woke at 0500, as she had every morning for the past 8 years, her body conditioned to function on minimal sleep and maximum alertness. She dressed in her supply clerk uniform, carefully maintaining the slight slovenliness that characterized Elizabeth Crawford. A button not quite aligned, bootlaces tied competently but not with military precision, hair pulled back in a regulation bun that was just messy enough to suggest someone who met standards without exceeding them. The face in the mirror was her mother's face, or close enough that anyone who had known Captain Elizabeth Thorne might have done a double take. Eve had inherited her mother's bone structure, her dark hair, her green eyes that could shift from warm to cold in an instant. She had been 3 years old when her mother died in Kuwait, too young to remember anything concrete, just impressions, the smell of her mother's shampoo, the sound of her laugh, the feeling of being lifted up into strong arms and spun around until the world became a blur of joy and motion. And then, nothing. Just a folded flag and a letter from the Department of Defense expressing the nation's gratitude for her mother's ultimate sacrifice. Eve had joined the Navy at 18, driven by something she could not quite articulate, a need to understand the woman she had never really known, a desire to prove she was worthy of the legacy her mother had left behind. SEAL training had nearly broken her. The instructors had been ruthlessly clear that they did not care about her motivations or her family history. They cared only about whether she could meet the standard. She had met it, exceeded it, become one of the few women to earn the trident, and survive the crucible that turned ordinary humans into warriors capable of operating in the most hostile environments on Earth. And now she was here, at Fort Harrison, hunting a traitor who might have information about how her mother really died. Because despite what the official report said, Eve had never quite believed that Captain Elizabeth Thorne had simply been killed in a firefight with Iraqi forces. There were too many inconsistencies, too many classified sections in the after-action reports, too many questions that no one seemed willing to answer. It had taken her 6 years of carefully worded requests and leveraged connections to finally get access to the unredacted files. What she found there had changed everything. A mention of a possible betrayal, a reference to an American officer who might have compromised the mission, a name that appeared in one paragraph and then vanished from all subsequent documentation. Lieutenant Nathaniel Westbrook, now Colonel Nathaniel Westbrook, commanding officer of Fort Harrison. The man Eve had been sent here to investigate for selling classified military intelligence to foreign actors. The man who might have killed her mother. The supply office was located in a low concrete building on the eastern edge of the base, surrounded by warehouses and motor pools. Eve arrived at 0630, early enough to establish her reputation as a dedicated worker, late enough to avoid drawing attention as someone trying too hard. The office was empty when she entered. Her supervisor would not arrive until 700. That gave Eve 30 minutes of unsupervised access to the computer systems. She logged in using her Elizabeth Crawford credentials and began the careful process of navigating through requisition records and inventory databases. On the surface, she was simply familiarizing herself with the system. In reality, she was building a map of every supply transaction that had occurred on the base over the past 18 months. The Navy's Intelligence Division had flagged Fort Harrison after noticing unusual patterns in equipment requisitions. Military hardware that should have been accounted for was going missing. Shipments were being diverted. Serial numbers were being altered in databases. Someone with high-level access was systematically looting the supply chain. Eve's job was to identify the perpetrators, document the theft, and provide evidence that could be used for prosecution. But the more she dug into the records, the more complicated the picture became. 15 separate requisitions over the past 6 months, each one approved by Colonel Westbrook's digital signature, each one for equipment that never actually arrived at Fort Harrison. Night vision devices, encrypted communication gear, advanced targeting systems, the kind of hardware that was tightly controlled and carefully tracked, disappearing into a void that should have triggered immediate investigation. Except someone was covering the tracks, forging delivery confirmations, creating false paper trails. The forgeries were good, professional, the kind of work that required access to classified systems and knowledge of exactly how the military's Byzantine logistics bureaucracy functioned. Eve was taking screenshots and uploading them to an encrypted server when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. She closed the sensitive windows and pulled up a benign inventory spreadsheet just as the door opened. Master Sergeant Garrett Calloway stood in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Noticed you skipped breakfast." Eve accepted the coffee carefully. Garrett's office was in a different building. He had no official reason to be in the supply section at this hour. "Thank you, Master Sergeant. That's very thoughtful." Garrett closed the door behind him and walked over to the window, looking out at the motor pool where soldiers were beginning the day's maintenance routines. "Couldn't sleep last night," he said quietly. "Kept thinking about our conversation, about the coincidences." "Coincidences, Master Sergeant. Your name, Thorne, the way you move, the way you handle yourself under pressure." He turned to face her. "You look exactly like someone I knew a long time ago, someone who died in Kuwait in 1991. Eve felt her heart rate increase slightly, though her expression remained neutral. This was dangerous territory. "That's a long time ago, Master Sergeant." 33 years, Garrett agreed. "Long enough that most people have forgotten. But I haven't forgotten. Captain Elizabeth Thorne was one of the best soldiers I ever served with. She was also one of the best people I ever knew." He paused. "She had a daughter, a little girl, maybe 3 years old. I remember seeing a photo on her desk." The silence stretched between them. Eve could deny it, should deny it. Maintaining operational security meant keeping her personal history completely separate from her cover identity. But looking at Garrett's face, seeing the old pain there, the decades of unanswered questions, she made a decision that every instinct told her was wrong. "She was my mother." Garrett closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been rage, or might have been both. "I knew it. The moment I saw you, I knew. You have her eyes, her way of standing." He stopped, collecting himself. "Does anyone else know?" "No. My assignment here has nothing to do with my personal history. The Navy doesn't know about the connection. It's pure coincidence that I was sent to this base. Is it? Garrett moved closer, lowering his voice. Your mission here, intelligence gathering related to security threats. What exactly are you investigating? Eve hesitated. Operational security protocols were clear. She should not be sharing mission details with anyone outside her chain of command. But Garrett had kept her secret. More importantly, he clearly knew something about what had happened to her mother. Colonel Westbrook, she said finally, someone in the intelligence community flagged suspicious financial transactions, equipment going missing, classified information possibly being sold to foreign actors. I was sent to gather evidence. Garrett's expression went from concerned to something darker, something that looked like vindication mixed with fury. Westbrook, he repeated. Of course it's Westbrook. You know something. It was not a question. Garrett's reaction made it clear he had information. Your mother didn't die in a random firefight, Garrett said, his voice low and intense. She was assassinated by someone on our own team, someone who had been bought by foreign intelligence services and who knew she was close to figuring it out. The words hit Eve like physical blows. She had suspected, had spent years trying to prove it, but hearing confirmation from someone who had been there made it real in a way that classified documents never could. Tell me everything. Garrett walked back to the window, his hands clenched behind his back, and began to speak. February 27th, 1991. Your mother and I were part of a Delta Force team hunting an Iraqi colonel who had information about chemical weapons programs. We had him located in a bunker 30 miles north of the Saudi border. The mission was straightforward: breach, capture, extract. He paused, the memories clearly painful, even after 3 decades. Lieutenant Nathaniel Westbrook was our liaison officer. Young, ambitious, hungry to make a name for himself. He was supposed to be coordinating with higher command, keeping them updated on our position and status. But something was wrong. The radio traffic was off, the timing was wrong, and when we reached the target, everything went to hell. Eve listened in silence as Garrett described the explosion, the ambush, the 3 silenced shots that had killed her mother while she bled out in his arms. She told me with her last breath, Syed Westbrook had sold us out, said he was working for the other side. I spent 2 years trying to prove it, but Westbrook's file was protected. Someone high up in the intelligence community had decided he was too valuable to prosecute. Or maybe they were compromised too. I never found out which. And now he's here, Eve said quietly, commanding a base, still stealing, still betraying. And you're here to stop him. Garrett turned to face her. Your mother would be proud, but she would also be terrified, because Westbrook is not just a thief, he's a killer. And if he even suspects what you're really doing here, you'll end up just like she did. Eve felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through SEAL training, through combat deployments, through missions that should have killed her, but had instead made her stronger. Then we make sure he doesn't suspect, and we gather enough evidence to bury him so deep he never sees daylight again. We? Garrett raised an eyebrow. You're involved now, Master Sergeant. You've been involved for 33 years. Time to finish what my mother started. Garrett considered for a long moment, then nodded slowly. What do you need? Before Eve could answer, her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from SEAL Command. She glanced at the screen and felt her blood run cold. Problem? Garrett asked. Intel update. They've identified Westbrook's contact, Russian national named Dmitry Volkov, former GRU officer during the Soviet era, now operates as a private military contractor. He's been in the United States for the past 6 months under a business visa. Does the intel say what Volkov is buying? Eve scrolled through the message, her expression growing increasingly grim. Everything. Weapon systems, communication protocols, base security procedures, troop deployment schedules. Westbrook isn't just stealing equipment, he's selling operational intelligence that could get American soldiers killed. Garrett's jaw tightened. When's the next transaction? Unknown, but there's a note here saying communication intercepts suggest something big is happening soon, possibly within the next 72 hours. Then we have 3 days to figure out what he's planning and stop it. Eve was about to respond when both their phones buzzed simultaneously. A base-wide alert. All personnel were to report immediately to their supervisory chains. Security condition had been elevated. No explanation provided. Garrett and Eve exchanged glances. Whatever was happening, it was happening now. The briefing room was packed with personnel from across the base. Eve and Garrett found positions near the back, trying to blend into the crowd while maintaining clear sight lines to the front of the room, where Colonel Nathaniel Westbrook stood behind a podium, his uniform immaculate, his expression grave. This was Eve's first time seeing him in person. She had studied photographs and video footage during her mission preparation, but none of that captured the physical presence of the man. He was 52 years old, tall and fit, with iron gray hair and the kind of command presence that came from decades of leadership. His chest displayed rows of ribbons and medals, a visual testament to a career of distinguished service. Looking at him, no one would ever suspect he was a traitor. Eve felt rage building in her chest and forced it down. Emotions were liabilities. Focus was survival. Westbrook raised his hands, and the room gradually quieted. "I know you all have questions about the security alert," he began. "I'm going to be direct with you. We have received intelligence suggesting potential hostile activity targeting this installation." A murmur ran through the crowd. "At this time, we do not have specific information about the nature or timing of the threat. However, out of an abundance of caution, we are implementing enhanced security protocols effective immediately. All personnel will be subject to random ID checks. All vehicles entering or leaving the base will be thoroughly inspected. Non-essential movement between sections will be restricted." Eve felt Garrett tense beside her. Enhanced security meant their ability to investigate would be severely limited. It also meant Westbrook was worried about something. "I want to emphasize," Westbrook continued, "that there is no cause for alarm. These measures are purely precautionary. We have the finest soldiers in the world on this base, and I have complete confidence in our ability to handle any situation that might arise." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. For just a moment, his gaze passed over Eve, and she felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in that look, an assessment, a calculation. "That's all for now," Westbrook concluded. "Supervisors will provide additional guidance to their units. Dismissed." The crowd began to disperse. Eve started to move toward the exit, but Garrett caught her arm. "Wait! Look!" He was staring at the front of the room, where Westbrook was speaking quietly with a man Eve did not recognize. The man was in his late 40s, wearing civilian clothes that were expensive but deliberately understated. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who was used to being in control. "That's not military," Garrett said quietly. "That's private sector, or intelligence." Eve pulled out her phone and took a discreet photo. She sent the image to her SEAL contact with a simple query. The response came back in less than 30 seconds. "Dmitry Volkov, former GRU, currently on CIA watch list. What's he doing at Fort Harrison?" Eve showed the message to Garrett, whose expression went from concerned to alarmed. "He's here, on the base, in uniform view." Garrett shook his head. "Westbrook is either incredibly arrogant or incredibly desperate." "Or both," Eve said. "We need to follow them." "Too risky. With enhanced security, I don't care. This is our chance. Volkov wouldn't be here in person unless something major was happening." Garrett looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment, he nodded. "All right, but we do this smart. Intelligence gathering only." They waited until Westbrook and Volkov left the briefing room, then followed at a careful distance. The two men moved through the command building with the ease of people who belong there, eventually exiting through a side door that led toward the vehicle depot. Eve and Garrett maintained their surveillance from behind a maintenance building, watching as Westbrook and Volkov walked to a black sedan with civilian plates. They appeared to be having an intense discussion, though the distance was too great to hear actual words. Then something happened that changed everything. A third person approached the sedan, someone in a military uniform, someone who moved with the kind of nervous energy that suggested they did not want to be seen. Eve raised her phone and zoomed in on the face. Private Lucas Grant, 21 years old, supply clerk, assigned to the same office where Eve worked. Grant handed something to Volkov. It looked like a manila envelope. Volkov opened it briefly, glanced at the contents, then nodded. Grant received what appeared to be cash in return, then hurried away looking like he wanted to disappear into the ground. "We have a mole in the supply office," Eve said. "That's how Westbrook has been covering his tracks. Grant has access to all the inventory systems." Eve was already uploading the photos to her encrypted server. "It's a start, but we need more. We need to document the actual transfer of classified materials." Westbrook and Volkov got into the sedan and drove away, heading toward the main gate. Eve watched them go. They're leaving the base, together, in the middle of a security lockdown that Westbrook himself just announced. She turned to Garrett. "This isn't about protecting the base from external threats. This is about creating cover for whatever Westbrook and Volkov are planning." Her phone buzzed. Another encrypted message from SEAL Command. "Communication intercepts indicate possible major transaction tonight. Location unknown. Authorization given for direct action if opportunity presents itself. Backup available on request, but will require minimum 4 hours to deploy." Eve showed the message to Garrett. "4 hours, he said. "If something is happening tonight, backup won't get here in time. Then we handle it ourselves." Eve thought for a moment, then remembered something from the supply records. Hangar 7, it's been flagged for maintenance for the past 2 weeks. Completely off limits to normal personnel. No requisitions processed through the system. She looked at Garrett. "What if it's not actually being maintained? What if Westbrook has been using it as a staging area?" Garrett considered this. "Hangar 7 is on the far edge of the base. Isolated, easy to secure. If I were running an illegal operation, that's where I'd do it." "Then that's where we start. Tonight, after dark, we do a reconnaissance. And if we find something, then we call in backup and we shut this down. Permanently." They separated, each returning to their official duties for the remainder of the day. Eve spent the afternoon processing requisition forms and pretending she did not notice Private Grant's nervous energy. At 2100 hours, dressed in dark clothing with her face shadowed by a cap, she slipped out of her quarters and made her way toward the motor pool. Garrett was already there, wearing similar attire. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Eve nodded. They moved through the base using routes that avoided security cameras and regular patrol paths. Garrett's decades of experience proved invaluable. He knew every blind spot, every timing gap. Hangar 7 loomed ahead, a massive structure that could hold multiple aircraft and vehicles. It was dark except for 2 flickering lights near the loading doors. Eve and Garrett approached from the eastern side, staying low, using vehicles and equipment as cover. When they reached the exterior wall, Eve placed her hand against the metal. She could feel vibration, machinery running inside. She made hand signals to Garrett. "Circle around, find entry point." He nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Eve continued along the wall until she found a maintenance access door. It was locked, but the lock was standard military issue. She pulled a set of picks from her pocket and had it open in under 30 seconds. The interior of the hangar was dimly lit, but what Eve could see made her blood run cold. 20 large crates, each marked with military identification codes. But these were not the codes from Fort Harrison's inventory. These were serial numbers from other bases, other units, equipment that had been reported as properly accounted for, but had actually been diverted here. She moved closer, using her phone to photograph the markings. Then she opened one of the crates. Inside were communication encryption devices. military-grade technology that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit and was tightly controlled by the Department of Defense. The next crate contained night vision equipment. The one after that held components for targeting systems used in advanced weapon platforms. This was not just theft. This was enough hardware to outfit a small army or to sell for millions of dollars to foreign governments. Eve was documenting everything when she heard voices outside. She immediately killed her phone light and moved behind a stack of crates. The loading door began to open with a mechanical whine. Headlights swept across the interior. A truck backed in, followed by the black sedan. Westbrook and Volkov emerged from the sedan. 3 other men got out of the truck, all of them wearing civilian clothes, all of them moving with practiced efficiency. "Everything is here as promised," Westbrook was saying. 20 crates. Manifests have been altered to show proper disposition. No one will be looking for this equipment. Volkov walked to one of the crates and opened it, examining the contents. "Acceptable," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. "The payment will be transferred once we confirm authenticity." "Half now," Westbrook said firmly, "half on delivery." That was the agreement. Volkov smiled without warmth. "Colonel, you are hardly in a position to dictate terms." The tension between them was palpable. Eve remained absolutely still, barely breathing. "The money, Dmitri, or we're done." After a long moment, Volkov gestured to one of his men, who went back to the truck and returned with a metal briefcase. He opened it to reveal stacks of cash. $2 million, Volkov said. "As agreed. The remaining $2 million when we confirm the equipment functions as specified." Westbrook took the briefcase and began counting. While he was distracted, Eve noticed movement from the corner of her eye. Garrett had entered through the same door she had used. He was positioning himself on the opposite side of the hangar, his phone out, recording everything. But then disaster struck. One of Volkov's men noticed the door was not quite closed properly. He moved toward it, his hand going to a weapon holstered at his side. Eve knew she had seconds to make a decision. If the man found Garrett, her cover would be blown. Garrett would be killed, and Westbrook would disappear. She did the only thing she could do. She triggered the fire alarm. The sudden blaring of klaxons and flashing emergency lights sent the hangar into chaos. Westbrook shouted something Eve could not hear over the noise. Volkov and his men scattered, heading for their vehicles. The automatic sprinkler system activated, soaking everything. In the confusion, Eve moved. She grabbed 2 hard drives from an open laptop on a nearby table, shoved them into her jacket, then made for the exit. She could see Garrett doing the same. They made it outside just as base security vehicles arrived. In the darkness and confusion, 2 more running figures were not noticed. They did not stop until they were back in the administrative section, soaking wet, breathing hard, but alive. "That was insane," Garrett gasped. "But we didn't get killed," Eve replied, pulling out the hard drives. "And we got these. With any luck, they contain evidence of every transaction Westbrook has made. And we got it all on video. Both of us. Multiple angles." Her phone buzzed. Message from SEAL Command. "Security alert at Fort Harrison noted. Backup team en route. ETA 3 hours. Advise status." Eve typed rapidly. "Evidence secured. Targets identified. Request immediate arrest authorization for Colonel Nathaniel Westbrook and Russian national Dmitry Volkov." The response came quickly. "Authorization granted. Maintain surveillance until backup arrives. Do not engage alone." Eve showed the message to Garrett. 3 hours. We just have to keep eyes on Westbrook for 3 more hours, and this is over." But even as she said it, she knew it would not be that simple. Because when she looked up, standing in the doorway of the building they had taken refuge in, was Colonel Nathaniel Westbrook himself, and he was pointing a gun directly at her. "Hello, Sergeant Thorne," he said quietly. "I think it's time we had a conversation about why you're really here." Time seemed to freeze. Eve stood in the doorway of the administrative building, water still dripping from her clothes, the stolen hard drives pressed against her ribs beneath her jacket, and Colonel Nathaniel Westbrook pointing a Beretta M9 at her center mass from a distance of approximately 12 feet. Her SEAL training provided immediate tactical assessment. Westbrook's stance was professional, weight distributed properly, finger indexed along the frame rather than the trigger. The weapon was steady. His eyes were calm. This was not panic. This was a man who had made a calculated decision. Behind her, she could sense Garrett tensing. Eve made a subtle hand gesture at her side, a signal to hold position. Any sudden movement would force Westbrook to fire. "Hands where I can see them," Westbrook said quietly. "Both of you," slowly. Eve raised her hands, keeping them open and visible. Garrett did the same. They were both unarmed. "I have to admit," Westbrook continued, "you almost had me fooled. Elizabeth Crawford, supply clerk from Fort Bragg, very convincing, but you made one critical mistake." "What mistake would that be, Colonel?" Eve kept her voice steady. "You look exactly like someone I killed 33 years ago. Captain Elizabeth Thorne, brilliant operator, absolutely relentless investigator. Had she lived another 48 hours, she would have destroyed my entire career before it even really began." Westbrook smiled without warmth. "You're her daughter, aren't you? Had to be. The resemblance is too perfect." Eve said nothing. The silence was its own answer. "I thought so," Westbrook nodded, "which means this isn't just about the supply irregularities. This is personal. You came here looking for revenge." "I came here looking for justice," Eve replied coldly. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Westbrook gestured with the gun toward a side office. "Both of you, inside. We're going to have a very civilized conversation about what happens next. Because if either of you does anything that forces me to shoot you, I assure you I have the authority and the cover story to make your deaths look completely justified." They moved into the office as directed. It was small, windowless, furnished with a desk and 3 chairs. Westbrook closed the door behind them and locked it, then gestured for Eve and Garrett to sit. He remained standing, the weapon still trained on them. "Master Sergeant Calloway," Westbrook said, "I remember you. Kuwait, 1991. You were there when Captain Thorne died. You tried for 2 years to prove I was responsible, made quite a nuisance of yourself." "You murdered her," Garrett said, his voice shaking with suppressed fury. "Shot her 3 times in the back while she was trying to complete the mission you sabotaged." "I eliminated a security threat," Westbrook corrected. Captain Thorne had discovered irregularities in intelligence reporting. She was asking uncomfortable questions. She was 12 hours away from identifying me as the leak. I did what was necessary to protect an operation that was critical to national security. "You were selling intelligence to Iraqi forces," Eve said. "How is that critical to national security?" "Because the intelligence I was selling was carefully curated by the CIA," Westbrook replied. "False information designed to mislead Iraqi command about our actual intentions. I was part of a deception operation that helped end the war with minimal American casualties. Your mother's death, tragic as it was, saved thousands of American lives." The explanation was delivered with such calm certainty that for a moment Eve almost believed it. Almost. "That's a very convenient story, Colonel. Does it help you sleep at night?" Westbrook's expression hardened. "It's the truth, and it's a truth that remains classified at the highest levels. Your mother died a hero, Sergeant Thorne. She died protecting an operation she didn't even know existed. The fact that you can't accept that isn't my problem." "Then why are you stealing military equipment and selling it to Russian agents?" Garrett demanded. For the first time, Westbrook's composure cracked slightly. "You don't understand the game being played here. The world has changed since 1991. The threats have evolved. Sometimes protecting America means doing things that look wrong from the outside." "You're not serving anything except your own bank account," Eve said. "I saw the briefcase. $2 million in cash. That's not patriotism. That's treason." Call it what you want, Westbrook replied. The fact remains that you have no proof that will stand up in any court. You broke into a secure hangar without authorization. You triggered a false alarm. You stole classified hard drives. The chain of custody has been so thoroughly compromised that no prosecutor would touch it. Eve felt a chill run through her. He was right. But here's what's going to happen, Westbrook continued. I'm going to give you both a choice. You can walk away, return to your normal duties, forget everything you think you saw tonight. In exchange, I won't press charges. You get to keep your careers, your freedom, and your lives. And if we refuse, Garrett asked, then I shoot you both right now, claim you were foreign agents who infiltrated the base, and the investigation will conclude exactly what I tell it to conclude. I've been doing this for 33 years. I know how to make problems disappear. The weapon never wavered. Westbrook was not bluffing. Eve's mind raced through options. She was unarmed, sitting, with a trained shooter holding her at gunpoint. Even her SEAL training had limits. But then Eve remembered something Westbrook had said, something that did not quite fit. If you were really part of a sanctioned CIA operation, she said slowly, you wouldn't be threatening to kill us. You'd detain us and turn us over to counterintelligence. The fact that you're offering us a deal means you're not protected anymore. Whatever cover you had in 1991, you don't have it now. Westbrook's expression flickered, just for a moment. You're acting alone, Eve continued. The CIA isn't protecting you. You've gone rogue, and now you're trying to clean up your mess before anyone figures it out. It doesn't matter what you think you know, Westbrook said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. You still have no way to prove anything. Actually, said a new voice from the doorway, she does. Everyone turned. Corporal Brennan O'Malley stood in the now open door, his phone held up, screen glowing. I've been recording this entire conversation, O'Malley said, his voice steady despite the clear fear in his eyes. Video and audio, already uploaded to cloud storage. My friends have copies. If anything happens to me, it goes straight to the FBI. Westbrook swung the gun toward O'Malley, his finger moving to the trigger. Eve saw her opportunity. She exploded from the chair, covering the 12 feet in less than 2 seconds, her hand striking Westbrook's wrist with precisely applied force that sent the gun flying. Westbrook was fast, but Eve was faster. She drove her knee into his solar plexus, following with an elbow strike that sent him staggering backward. He tried to throw a punch. She caught his arm, twisted, and used his momentum to send him crashing into the desk. Garrett was already moving, retrieving the fallen weapon, keeping it trained on Westbrook, who was now on the floor, gasping for breath. Don't move, Garrett said quietly. I've waited 33 years for this. Eve turned to O'Malley. How long have you been following us? She asked. Since you left your quarters, O'Malley replied. After what happened in the mess hall, I knew you weren't just a supply clerk. I wanted to understand who you really were. He paused. I didn't expect this. Why help us? O'Malley lowered his phone. Because Master Sergeant Calloway told me something yesterday. He said that being a soldier isn't about being tough or strong. It's about knowing what's right and having the courage to do it. He looked at Westbrook with disgust. This isn't right. Eve allowed herself a brief smile. Thank you, Corporal. You might have just saved our lives. Her phone buzzed. Message from SEAL Command. Backup team ETA 30 minutes. MP unit standing by. Advise status. Eve typed rapidly. Target secured. Evidence obtained. Request immediate arrest team for Colonel Westbrook and apprehension team for Dmitry Volkov and associates. Within minutes, the building was surrounded by military police. Westbrook was handcuffed and read his rights. He said nothing, his expression cold as they led him away. Garrett stood watching, tears streaming down his face. It's done, he said quietly. Elizabeth, it's finally done. He's going to pay for what he did to you. Eve placed a hand on his shoulder. My mother would be grateful for everything you did, everything you sacrificed. I just wish she could have seen it, Seen you. She would have been so proud. The night dissolved into a blur of debriefings and evidence processing. FBI agents arrived within the hour. Military intelligence took custody of the hard drives. A team of Navy SEALs deployed to intercept Volkov at a private airfield 30 miles from the base. By dawn, 17 people had been arrested. Dmitry Volkov was in federal custody facing charges of espionage. Private Lucas Grant had confessed and was cooperating with investigators. The network of corruption that Westbrook had built over 3 decades was unraveling. Eve stood outside the command building as the sun rose over Fort Harrison, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and gold. She was exhausted, battered, and her cover was completely blown. But the mission was complete, more than complete. She had done what her mother had tried to do 33 years ago. Garrett approached, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He looked as tired as she felt, but there was something else in his expression. Peace. Closure. "The colonel who runs the investigation team wants to talk to you," he said. "They're very interested in how a supply clerk managed to take down a major espionage operation." "I had help," Eve replied. "A lot of help." "O'Malley is being hailed as a hero. He's handling it better than I expected." Eve smiled. "He's learning." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the base come to life. Soldiers heading to breakfast, vehicles moving toward motor pools, the ordinary rhythms of military life continuing. "What happens now?" Garrett asked. "Your cover is blown. I'll be reassigned. New mission, new identity. That's how it works." "Will you ever come back?" Eve considered the question. "I don't know. Maybe. But right now, I think I need to finish what my mother started in a different way." "What do you mean?" "She was investigating corruption in military intelligence. Westbrook was just one piece. According to the files we recovered, there are others. People who helped him. People who are still out there." Garrett nodded slowly. "So this doesn't end with Westbrook?" "No, this is just the beginning." 3 weeks later, Eve stood in front of a memorial wall at Arlington National Cemetery. A new plaque had been added to the section honoring soldiers who died during Desert Storm. Captain Elizabeth Thorne's name was engraved in bronze, along with dates of service and a citation about her sacrifice. The official story had been corrected. Elizabeth Thorne had not died in a random firefight. She had been investigating intelligence leaks when she was killed by a compromised American officer. Her work had ultimately led to the capture of a spy network that had operated for over 3 decades. She was being posthumously awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal. It was not enough. It would never be enough, but it was something. Eve placed her hand on the plaque, feeling the warm bronze beneath her fingers. "I found him, Mom," she whispered. "I made him pay, and I'm going to find the others, all of them. I promise." A hand touched her shoulder. She turned to find Garrett standing beside her, dressed in his service uniform. He saluted the memorial, holding the gesture for a long moment. "She would be proud of you," he said, "not just because you caught Westbrook, because of who you've become." "I learned from the best," Eve replied. "Both of them." They stood together in silence, 2 soldiers paying respects to a fallen comrade, a friend, a mother. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the rows of white marble headstones. Behind them, near the entrance, Corporal O'Malley stood with Wyatt Donovan, Dustin Kowalski, and Colton Wheeler. The 4 young soldiers had driven from Fort Harrison to Arlington to pay their respects. Eve noticed them and walked over. O'Malley came to attention immediately. "At ease, Corporal," Eve said. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Yes, we did, ma'am," O'Malley replied. "You taught us something important. About honor, about duty." He paused. "I want to apologize again for what happened in the mess hall. It was wrong. I was wrong." "I can see that," Eve said. "The fact that you're here proves it." "Master Sergeant Calloway has been helping us," Donovan added, "training us properly, teaching us what it really means to be a soldier." Good, Eve replied. Listen to him. He has more wisdom than most people accumulate in a lifetime. Kowalski hesitated, then asked, Ma'am, is it true you're a Navy SEAL? Eve glanced at Garrett, who shrugged slightly. The truth was going to come out eventually. Yes, she said simply. Wheeler's eyes went wide. We're lucky to be alive. You're lucky she has discipline and control, Garrett interjected. But you're also lucky she saw potential in you worth preserving. Don't waste it. We won't, Master Sergeant, O'Malley promised. After the young soldiers left, Eve and Garrett walked slowly through the cemetery, past rows of markers commemorating the fallen from every American conflict. Warriors who had given everything in service to their country. What did the SEAL Command say about your next assignment? Garrett asked. They offered me instructor duty, train the next generation. It's a good assignment, prestigious, safe. But you turned it down. I turned it down, Eve confirmed. There's still work to do, people to find. My mother's investigation identified 3 other potential compromised officers. Westbrook wouldn't give them up, even in exchange for a plea deal. But the evidence is there. That's dangerous work. It's what I was trained for. Garrett stopped walking and turned to face her directly. Elizabeth asked me to keep you safe. I failed her once. I don't want to fail again. You haven't failed anyone, Eve said firmly. You honored her memory by never giving up, by helping me finish what she started. She would never consider that failure. Garrett smiled sadly. You are just like your mother. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. I want you to have this. Eve unwrapped the cloth and found herself holding 2 dog tags. One was new, shiny, with her mother's name and service number engraved. The other was older, worn, the engraving barely visible after decades of handling. The new one is your mother's official tag, Garrett explained. They issued it when they updated her memorial. The old one, that's the one she was actually wearing when she died. I took it before they processed her body. I've carried it every day for 33 years, kept it as a reminder, as a promise that someday, somehow, justice would be served. Eve felt tears welling up, the first genuine emotion she had allowed herself to feel since this entire operation began. I can't take this. It was mine, Garrett corrected gently. I kept it safe until I could give it to someone who would carry on her legacy. That's you, Eve. Take the tags. Let them remind you that you're never alone, that your mother's courage lives on in you. Eve closed her fingers around the dog tags, feeling their weight, their history, their meaning. Thank you, she managed, for everything, for never forgetting her. Thank you for finishing the mission, for being brave enough to face the truth, for being the warrior your mother trained you to become, even though she never got to see it. They embraced, 2 soldiers bound by shared loss and shared purpose, standing among thousands of markers commemorating others who had made the same sacrifice. When they finally separated, Eve slipped the dog tags around her neck, tucking them beneath her shirt, where they rested against her heart. The metal was warm from Garrett's handling, and it felt right to wear them. Where will you go? Garrett asked. Germany first, then possibly the Middle East. The intelligence suggests that's where the other compromised officers have been operating. It'll take time, months, maybe years, but I'll find them. And after that? Eve smiled. Maybe I'll take that instructor position, teach young SEALs how to operate in a world where the threats are complex and the answers are never simple. Pass on the lessons I learned, the ones my mother would have taught me if she'd lived. She would like that, Garrett said. They walked back toward the parking area. The cemetery was beginning to fill with other visitors, families paying respects to lost loved ones, veterans honoring fallen comrades. At the entrance, they paused one final time. If you ever need anything, Garrett said, information, backup, just someone to talk to who understands, you know how to reach me. I do, and I will. This isn't goodbye, Master Sergeant. It's just until next time. Until next time, Garrett agreed. He saluted, formal, imprecise. Eve returned the salute, holding it for a moment that acknowledged everything they had been through together, everything they had accomplished, everything still to come. Then he was gone, driving away toward whatever his next chapter held. Eve watched him go, then turned back toward the memorial one last time. The sun was higher now, the morning cooling into afternoon. Birds sang in the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a bugler was practicing taps, the mournful notes carrying across the manicured lawns. Eve touched the dog tags through her shirt, feeling their outline. "I have to go now, Mom," she whispered, "but I'll be back. When it's done, when all of them are brought to justice, I'll come back and tell you everything. I promise." The wind stirred the trees, and for just a moment, Eve could almost believe it was an answer. A mother's blessing on a daughter's mission. She walked toward her vehicle, shoulders back, head high, every inch the warrior her mother had been, and more. The dog tags rested against her heart, a constant reminder of what she was fighting for and who she was fighting to honor. Behind her, the memorial stood silent and eternal. One name among thousands, one sacrifice among millions. But to Eve, it was everything. The beginning and the end of a story that had taken 33 years to complete. Colonel Nathaniel Westbrook would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Dmitry Volkov and his associates were facing trial for espionage. The network of corruption was being systematically dismantled. But there were others, always others. The fight was never truly over. There would always be people willing to betray their country. There would always be soldiers willing to sacrifice everything to stop them. Eve Thorne was one of those soldiers, just like her mother before her, just like the countless others whose names were engraved on memorials and monuments across the world. Warriors, guardians, protectors. She drove away from Arlington as the afternoon sun climbed toward its peak, heading toward whatever mission waited next, carrying her mother's memory, her mother's courage, and her mother's unfinished work into an uncertain future. Some debts took a lifetime to repay, some promises took decades to fulfill, some truths took generations to uncover. But in the end, honor always had a price, and warriors like Eve Thorne were always willing to pay it. The road stretched ahead, empty and waiting. She pressed the accelerator and drove toward whatever came next, ready for anything, afraid of nothing, alone but never lonely. Because the warriors who came before her walked beside her, in memory and spirit, guiding her steps and lighting her way. And that was enough. It would always be enough.